Hello, this video is about things I have learnt from the Greek text of Romans chapter 3. Romans, probably the most important and significant letter ever written, and when you study it in its original languages, there's a lot to be learnt. So let's get into it. My first note, of course a lot more could be said, but these are in some ways random points that just struck me that I've learnt since I have spent time learning Greek and then studying this letter in Greek. So firstly here, notice the similarity in sound between these two words that follow each other. Tropon and proton. And that similarity in sound moves his argument along smoothly. As I've said in previous videos in this series, the sound of a word is seen as significant in a pre-scientific age. And notice also that Paul says, first of all, proton, but he never gets around to secondly, and so on. Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages was the first to write thorough and systematic theology. This also set a pattern for modern Western writing on any subject, for example, scientific writing. Paul's writing, actually he usually dictated his letters, was more free and impassioned, darting around everywhere. Okay, moving down, notice here that pistin means faithfulness, not faith, and apistia, unfaithfulness. So the a is equivalent to English un. So pistis, which often, usually, perhaps you could say means faith, here it takes a secondary meaning, faithfulness. And notice also me. As the Greek grammars tell us, me expects a negative answer, ou, the other negative, expects a positive answer, usually. Not always, but usually. Verse 4, me genoito, one of Paul's favorite little phrases. I would translate, certainly not. The King James said, God forbid, which must have been an expression in use in the 1600s. Paul wouldn't use the name of God like that. Notice here again in verse 5 we have chiasmus, A, B, B, A. The contrast between ours and God's is highlighted in the Greek by juxtaposing those two words, putting them right together. In English, the contrast is best made by straightening out the chiasmus and using intonation, as the NLT, New Living Translation, does, even if everyone else is a liar. These italics are mine just to show the intonation. Even if everyone else is a liar, God is true. Okay, coming along to verses 6, 7, and 8. And my comment here is to understand these verses we have to know the background. In fact, it's background that partly we know from Acts and the other accounts in the New Testament, and partly we have to deduce what Paul's opponents say from Paul's writings. So in other words, it's just like we're hearing half the conversation, but still we can make pretty good deductions about the sort of things they were saying. Fierce attacks were made on Paul by Jewish upholders of the law. Since Paul was saying you are put right by faith, not by obeying the law, they got very upset with him and flung wild accusations at him, including that he directly told people to sin. Okay, ou pantos. Now this is ambiguous. It could mean not at all, or it could mean not entirely. So you see how English makes the difference between two words that pretty much mean the same thing in English, but we've assigned one to one meaning and the other to the other meaning. So not at all means certainly not, no way, but not entirely means yes to some extent, but not entirely. Which exactly he means is a bit of a toss-up. Now here, coming down to verse 19, Paul has thrown together a succession of quotes from the Jewish Bible to silence his Jewish critics. This has been a key passage used in Reformed theology to back up their doctrine of, they call it the total depravity of mankind. In my view, this is wrong. Paul has chosen particular verses for a particular argument directed at a particular group of people. There are plenty of other scriptures to stop us applying this more broadly than it was intended. Romans chapter 2, verse 14 and 15, for example. And going to the Old Testament, I think of Joseph's Pharaoh, who is presented as a good man. Also in the New Testament, we meet a lot of Romans, for example, who are presented as more or less good people and with no hint of evil motives. Coming down to verse 21, so I'm covering ground fairly quickly here. To help us follow Paul's logic, I've made a little translation rearranging things a bit, shortening the sentences, and made the use of brackets or parentheses, as some people call them. Now, God's way of putting people right has been shown. It's not by the law, although the law and the prophets testified to it, and so on. Okay, dikaiumenoi dorian. I like that little phrase that has alliteration, meaning that it begins with the same letter, delta or D, and it makes a memorable phrase that is well worth remembering. Okay, here in verse 25, we come to the word blood. The root form of it is haima, that's the root form of it. And it's a translation problem. It has an extended meaning area that the English word doesn't. In English, we talk about things like bloodlines, red-blooded, blue blood, etc. But our English word blood doesn't normally extend to mean death and sacrificial death like the biblical word does. So speaking normal English, we wouldn't say, for example, the blood of the soldiers saved us. This sounds like they donated to the blood bank. But we would say maybe we were saved by the soldiers sacrificing their lives. The TEV translators, today's English version, which came out in the 1960s, they recognized this, and in several places they used the translations death and sacrificial death for the Greek word haima, whose first approximation translation is blood. But these translations are exactly what it means here. But they copped a lot of flack for it from people who had become attached to the old wording and didn't understand the issues. So the Good News Bible, which followed on from the TEV, changed it back to blood with a footnote saying sacrificial death, which I think is a pity that they felt they had to do that. Just noting here phrases eis indexin and prosten indexin. And I've discussed this before in previous videos on Romans, but I see this again as stylistic variation, not intending a difference of meaning, but it can be confusing to the learner learning biblical Greek, sees those two different phrases and expects them to have a different meaning. But as I see it, no different meaning is intended, it's just for the sake of his style. Here's another phrase that I like, dikaion kai dikaiunta. These two related words are thrown together to strikingly make his point. God is not guilty of wrong when he declares those who have faith in Jesus to be not guilty of wrong. Dikaion kai dikaiunta. Okay, here in verse 27, Paul makes use of another meaning of nomos. That's the base form nomos. Here is the genitive normal. And the other meaning could be expressed in English as principle, as the NIV 1984 translates it. And another good translation using a broader word would be on what basis? On the basis of faith. So Paul advances his argument and makes his point by taking advantage of the fact that the word he has here has another meaning. And same thing here as I mentioned before, stylistic variation, ek pisteos and dietes pisteos, very similar to the example with indexes that we looked at in previous verses. Okay, so we come to the last verse, verse 31. Dietes pisteos, the exact phrase that he used in the previous verse. The implication is, as I see it, will this flooding in of uncircumcised sinners destroy all the sanctity the law was carefully trying to build up? And Paul's answer is, certainly not. We are, in fact, upholding the law. Being a Christian is not a license to sin. And I just conclude with my two favorite phrases, dikaimenoi dorian in verse 23, talking about us Christians, and dikaion kai dikaunta, describing God from verse 25. These, to me, are the two memorable phrases from the chapter. I encourage people to memorize the whole thing if you can, or a chunk of it, or if not, simply memorize these two phrases because they're neatly expressed in Greek, and they have this nice alliteration with the D sound, and they pack so much important meaning into those few words.